Dayne did not die in the red dust of the Tower of Joy. The 3 Kingsguard who had stood so valiantly against Eddard Stark's host still fell. Ser Oswell went bleeding out first, groaning as he sank to the ground with a blade lodged in his gut. Ser Gerald Hightower gasping in disbelief when a northern sword found its way past his guard. But at the last, the man who was often whispered about in ballads, the greatest knight of his day, the Sword of the Morning, did not receive the mortal thrust of Howland Reed's spear as fate had once decreed. Instead, a subtle shift in the confusion of blades spared his life by the thinnest margin. Reeling, wounded in the side and with blood slick on his left hand, he lashed out on pure reflex and drove Dawn's shining edge into an attacker's thigh. Eddard Stark shouted for him to yield, to surrender for the sake of the realm, but Arthur's vision swam with sweat and blood, and he only knew he had to protect what remained of Prince Rhaegar's legacy. He had to remain on his feet for just a moment longer. At his call, there came a momentary lull. The Northerners, battered and mindful of how many good men they had lost, watched him with wariness rather than bloodlust. Eddard Stark, breathing heavily, observed Arthur's limp form, shoulders heaving, silver pommel of Dawn trembling in his hand. They were all spent, none more so than Stark himself, who wore a fresh gash across the brow, his hair matted with dust and sweat. Howland Reed remained behind him, uncertain whether the next step would be another pass of swords. Arthur, too, recognized the futility of continuing. 7 men had come with Stark, and 6 lay dead or gravely wounded. Went and Hightower were beyond saving. The whole desert air seemed to hum with the aftermath of violence. Arthur, his heart crashing in his chest, finally let Dawn's tip scrape the ground. It had never tasted so much blood. He wanted to keep fighting, but he knew that if he did, there would be no one left to secure Lyanna Stark, to fulfill Prince Rhaegar's last commands. Yet, in a moment of despair and clarity, Arthur knew that everything he had fought for had already been lost. Rhaegar was dead on the Trident, Aerys was slain, and the Targaryen dynasty was in tatters. He lowered his blade in an act of desperate concession, but not in true defeat. "Ser Arthur," said Eddard Stark, stepping forward, "yield. I do not want your life." His words came with heavy resignation. Arthur's breathing rasped. "For Prince Rhaegar's sake," he said, voice cracked with dryness, "I must ensure Lady Lyanna's safety." He swayed, half collapsing to one knee. He could not even stand. Eddard hesitated, then gestured for Howland Reed to help him. "She is my sister. You have my word. I will ensure no harm comes to her." Arthur let out a disbelieving breath. Yet in that moment, any measure of pride or fear of consequence succumbed to the throbbing pain in his side. He could not hold on. He remembered only half-lucid fragments of what happened next. Stark's solemn face, the rough hands binding his wound, and the hush of the tower behind them. When Arthur next woke, he was within the solemn shade of the tower's highest chamber. Dried blood crusted where the bandages pressed tight, and pain flared with every breath. A small, thin-faced man, Howland Reed, stepped away from the bed to give Eddard room. Dawn was resting against the stone wall, always near, but placed aside with a gentle respect that Arthur would not have expected from enemies. "She's gone," Eddard said softly, as if he knew Arthur's thoughts before they were spoken. "My sister is gone." Arthur felt the words like a wave of foreboding. He tried to sit up, ignoring the dull and persistent ache in his side. "Did you find?" "I did," Eddard answered, eyes dark with grief. "She was dying. I kept my promise to her." He said no more on that. Arthur could only guess the nature of the vow that bound them. Though the heat of Dorne weighed on him, a chill spread through his body at the thought of all that had been lost. Rhaegar, the future they had tried to protect, the secret that had demanded such sacrifice. Even if Robert Baratheon sat now on the Iron Throne, Arthur believed in the old lines of duty that did not vanish overnight. "I will take you north," Eddard said after a quiet moment. "There is no future for the Kingsguard in this realm. If Robert learns you live, he will demand your head. But I owe you and your fellow knights a debt for your bravery. I won't watch more men die." Arthur studied Eddard's drawn face. "And if I do not wish to flee?" Eddard pursed his lips. "It isn't fleeing. You are wounded. You will die if you stay here, or you will force my hand." "Do not make me do that, Sir Arthur." Arthur's jaw clenched, but he saw the truth in the man's calm brown eyes. The war was over, the kingdom changed. He tried to speak the promise that had weighed on him since Rhaegar's last instructions, but the words felt both urgent and dangerous. There were secrets the Sword of the Morning was bound to keep, secrets that, if revealed, might see him killed outright or cause a war anew. He simply nodded, letting his eyes close. They left the tower at dusk. Stark's loyalists burned the bodies of the fallen. Arthur, too weak to even set the pyre ablaze, muttered a quiet farewell. Eddard had said they would demolish the tower after the funerary rites, so that the place of so much sorrow would trouble no more. Arthur clung to consciousness, rattling in and out of feverish dreams. Many times he thought he saw Rhaegar's face in the desert sun. Other times he saw Ares as a black silhouette of madness, consumed by wildfire. He remembered the White Sword Tower in King's Landing, how proud he had been to guard the gates of the Targaryen seat of power. Now he was half dying on a horse, a prisoner or a ward to Eddard Stark. He did not know what future awaited him, but he still kept a tight hold on one vow. If the realm demanded it, he would find a way to serve again. They traveled by night to escape the scorching Dornish sun, and by the time they reached Starfall, a place Arthur had once called home, they had decided it was too dangerous for him to remain. Arthur watched from a distance while Eddard sent a quiet message into the keep. House Dayne welcomed the news that their storied son still lived, but they feared what an open presence might mean in the new regime. It was Prince Oberyn Martell who had offered some measure of safe passage, if only because the Martells hated the new King Robert for the fate that had befallen Elia and her children. But open rebellion was impossible. House Martell had been forced to bend the knee. Arthur said farewell to his sister Ashera and to the rest of his house from the darkness of a secret cove, so that no rumor would give him away. It pained him to be so close to his own kin and yet remain hidden, but he yielded to Eddard's warnings. Ashera wept for him, her tears silent but fierce. She pressed her forehead against her brother's. "Take care," she said, voice trembling. "I will," Arthur said, and for a moment, he felt all the sorrow of this broken realm. They set out for the north soon after. In the days that followed, Arthur improved little. The infection in his side lingered, and though he was tall and strong, the wound had been perilously deep. Eddard's maester had done what he could, but the journey on horseback strained him. They spent weeks winding through back roads and seldom used passes to avoid the new king's soldiers, or else those loyal to Tywin Lannister. Arthur gleaned that the Lannisters had sacked King's Landing, that the Targaryen children had been slaughtered, though rumors abounded about a babe that might or might not have escaped. In truth, the kingdom was a mess of rumor and fear. Arthur traveled in a half-delirium, forcing himself not to die, not to succumb to guilt and grief. If Rhaegar's last child had survived, if that secret was real, then Arthur would do everything in his power to protect it. If no child survived, then perhaps the realm needed him for another reason. Either way, the realm had changed, and so had he. The north greeted them with cold wind and gray skies. Eddard brought Arthur straight to Winterfell, where they were received quietly by the household. Most of the inhabitants had never laid eyes on a Kingsguard knight before, and fewer still had imagined he might be brought home by their new lord, hidden under cloak and rumor. He was assigned modest quarters near the maester's chambers so he could fully recover. Through the stone corridors he moved gingerly, ignoring stares and murmured questions. Winterfell's architecture felt strange to him, a far cry from the sun-washed walls of Dorne or the grand spires of the Red Keep. Here, the gloom and the howling winds made it seem like a fortress carved from the very bones of the earth. Weeks passed. Eddard resumed his lordly duties, but he visited Arthur often. The two men rarely discussed the tower, or Lyanna, or the war's end. Eddard had a newborn child, Robb Stark, to care for. He was also negotiating with Robert's newly appointed officials for the shape of the realm under the new monarchy. The quiet man who had fought so valiantly at the Tower of Joy seemed burdened by the weight of leadership. Arthur, meanwhile, had nightmares. He dreamed of blazing fires consuming King's Landing. He dreamed of black knights with lion sigils butchering children. He dreamed of Rhaegar's silver harp music turning to clangs of war. And always, he saw dawn at the edge of his vision, shining like a lonely star. When his strength returned, Arthur trained with the Yard's master-at-arms in secret. The man, Ser Roderick Castle, was skilled and tough, but Arthur's reputation preceded him. Even so, Arthur felt a new heaviness in his sword arm, a loss of the easy grace he'd once wielded. More than just the physical damage to his side, the months of inactivity and the weight of sorrow sapped him. Gradually, though, his old reflexes returned. The men in Winterfell whispered about the southern ghost, who practiced by torchlight so that none might see. One evening, as the snows began to gather, Eddard approached him in the courtyard. The sun had set, and the cold air stung Arthur's face. He had just finished a private training session, the courtyard lit by flickering torches. "Ser Arthur," Eddard said softly, "walk with me." They moved along the walls, the wind stirring Eddard's dark cloak. Arthur followed stiffly, wearing only a simple surcoat over boiled leather. He was unaccustomed to the biting chill, and though Dorne's desert nights could be cold, this was an entirely different realm. When they reached a more secluded space, Eddard paused and looked at Arthur gravely. "A raven came from King's Landing. Word has spread that Ser Barristan Selmy has joined King Robert's Kingsguard. They are rebuilding it, man by man." Arthur folded his arms. Ser Barristan the Bold had once been a comrade, a knight as honorable as any he'd known. Yet the idea of Barristan swearing anew to a Baratheon king stung him. "Barristan is a great man," Arthur finally replied, "and a loyal knight, no matter who sits the throne." "Yes," Eddard said carefully. "He's forgiven, pardoned for fighting on the Targaryen side. They even call him a hero for saving lives in the sack. But you, if Robert learns you live, he might not show the same mercy. You were the greatest of Aerys' swords, Rhaegar's sworn friend. He fears you, I think, and you've killed many good men in his cause. He might see you as a threat." Arthur looked out over Winterfell's courtyard. Squires were dousing the torches. The shapes of soldiers moved in silhouette. "I do not fear Robert Baratheon," he said quietly, "but I do not wish to invite further bloodshed on account of my survival." They stood in silence, and the wind rattled the ancient ramparts. Finally, Eddard spoke. "I propose a path forward, Ser Arthur. Serve me here, quietly but faithfully. You cannot linger as a secret occupant forever. It will slip out that you walk these halls. We can claim your loyalty for House Stark, an oath of fealty. With enough time, if Robert demands your head, I will protect you if I can. If he insists, then we will see. But you will remain safe so long as you vow not to incite any rebellion or threat. I do not want more war. The realm is tired." Arthur's lips formed a tight line. The old part of him, the Kingsguard part, howled that he had sworn his life to House Targaryen and no other. But the Targaryens were gone, or so it seemed. Rhaegar's children, if any had lived, were beyond his reach. If he refused, he would either die or vanish into Essos, skulking away like a broken sword. In that, there was no honor. At last, Arthur breathed. "I will swear to protect Winterfell as if it were my own. I will not raise arms against Robert, so long as Robert does not threaten me or those I protect." Eddard nodded, though regret glimmered in his eyes. "If the day comes that Robert demands your head, I cannot guarantee I can sway him, but I will try." And so it was that Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, pledged himself, informally but in earnest, to the Starks of Winterfell. Seasons passed. Robert Baratheon was crowned, and the realm settled into a tenuous peace. Eddard left to marry Catelyn Tully, forging an alliance that many saw as a gesture of unity under the new regime. Arthur remained behind to oversee Winterfell's defenses in Eddard's absence, officially introduced to the castle's residents as a sworn sword under Ned Stark's protection, a knight from Dorne who was an old friend from the war. No one called him by his full name openly. Many suspected, but none dared to voice it. For a time, Arthur existed in a curious quiet. He trained with the Stark Guards, forging friendships with some of the men-at-arms. He escorted Lady Catelyn to the Weirwood Grove when she arrived as a bride. He taught young squires to balance a longsword properly. Within the great hall, he ate in silence, mindful of eyes that would flick toward him. Few in the north had any love for the Targaryens or their Kingsguard, but respect for Eddard was high, and that respect extended some courtesy to the mysterious knight in his service. In his solitary moments, Arthur prayed to the Seven, or sometimes he lingered by the heart tree in the Gods' Wood. Though the old gods were foreign to him, the Weirwood face seemed to watch him. He was haunted by the Tower of Joy, by the illusions he had once cherished. Sometimes he would unsheath Dawn, carefully, in a private spot, and remember what it felt like to stand at Rhaegar's side, believing in a prophecy that the prince so fervently believed. Now that prophecy lay in tatters. Or did it? Arthur was no green seer, but at times he felt a weight of destiny pressing upon him. Then the letter arrived from King's Landing. It was a crisp morning when a royal raven soared into Winterfell. The letter was addressed to Eddard, but in his absence, Ser Roderick brought it to Arthur. Arthur opened the sealed parchment with caution. It bore the royal seal, though the wording was in the bold scrawl of Robert Baratheon. To Lord Eddard Stark, rumors have reached my ears that a certain white sword of the Mad King still draws breath in your domain. If so, I demand his presence in King's Landing. Justice must be seen. I will not have traitors to House Baratheon skulking in the north. If you harbor him in secret, you are bound by your honor to deliver him to me. Be assured, I offer mercy if he comes willingly. Barristan Selmy has spoken in favor of chivalry. But if this rumor is untrue, let us hear no more. By the grace of the gods, King Robert Baratheon, first of his name. Arthur read and reread the letter, his pulse in his throat. He did not fear Robert physically, but the last time they had crossed blades, Robert had hammered Rhaegar to death on the trident. A memory of that brutality made Arthur's hand tremble for the first time in a long while. He had expected this day to come. Eddard's vow was to keep him safe, but even Eddard's power had limits. Would Arthur truly place Winterfell in danger by forcing a confrontation with the king? As he stood by the windowsill, the letter resting in his palm, a wave of uncertain resolve washed over him. He had always been a man of action. He thrived in clarity of purpose. Now, the question was, did he surrender himself and beg for clemency? Or did he defy King Robert openly, risking the wrath of the Iron Throne? The next day, Eddard returned from the Vale, where he had been visiting Lord Arryn. The moment he arrived, Arthur delivered the letter and watched as Eddard's face grew solemn. "I will go to King's Landing," Arthur said, surprising even himself with the swiftness of the statement. "I will answer his summons. If your name is tarnished by my presence, I cannot." Eddard set a hand on his shoulder. "No, we will think this through, Ser Arthur. Robert is a proud man, but not without sense. Barristan may speak for you. I may speak for you." Arthur's eyes were steady. "He wants a sign of loyalty. Barristan's presence suggests he might not be wholly unforgiving to former Targaryen knights." Eddard nodded gravely. "I will accompany you. I will not send you alone." A flicker of gratitude passed between them. Whatever else had happened, they had bled together at the Tower of Joy and made a reluctant pact in its shadow. If Eddard Stark was anything, he was a man of honor. They rode south as the snows began to lighten. It was a smaller retinue than the one that had marched before, just Eddard Stark's personal guard, a few men-at-arms, and Arthur himself. His identity was still not openly declared, but rumors preceded them. Whispers circulated in the taverns and inns along the King's Road that the deadliest man in the realm, the Sword of the Morning, traveled with Ned Stark. Some said it was a stunt to challenge King Robert. Others claimed it was an attempt at peace. Arthur kept his hood pulled low, but whenever they trained in a courtyard or encountered lesser lords, his presence sparked talk. He occasionally glimpsed fear in men's eyes, but also awe. He was a figure out of legends and nightmares, the man who had last guarded Prince Rhaegar's dream. When they reached the gates of King's Landing, they found the city in a precarious new peace. The banners of House Baratheon flew over the walls, alongside the Lion of Lannister. The streets stank as they always did, but life had begun to return. Merchants hustled, children played, and the city watch in new black and gold cloaks eyed the visitors suspiciously. They made their way to the Red Keep. Arthur felt a swirl of old memories. The gleaming halls he had once walked in shining armor, the echo of footsteps across polished floors. He had arrived in King's Landing as a proud Kingsguard in the prime of his youth. Now a hush followed him as he passed. The guards parted at Eddard's word. They were brought before the throne, which Arthur regarded with silent fury. There Robert Baratheon sat, broad-shouldered, his thick black hair unbound, one hand resting on the pommel of a massive warhammer. The Iron Throne loomed behind him, jagged metal and swords hammered into shape long ago. An audience had gathered, courtiers, knights, lords, and ladies. Eddard bowed stiffly, ignoring the illusions of pomp. Arthur inclined his head but did not kneel. A hush fell. Robert's eyes pinned Arthur with a fierce intensity. "So," he said, voice echoing in the hall, "you are the sword of the morning. You look thinner than I remember, and you stand in my hall armed, after fighting against me in the war." Arthur wore plate and mail but carried no helm. Dawn was sheathed at his side. He would not walk these halls without it. "Your Grace," Arthur said calmly, "I come as a man prepared to answer for my actions." Robert's lips curled in a half-sneer. "Answer I? You stood by Prince Rhaegar, who put my betrothed to the torch. You were sworn to the Mad King's service." His knuckles tightened on the hammer. "And rumor says you almost killed Ned Stark. Is that true, Ned?" Eddard spoke plainly. "He could have, Your Grace. He fought to fulfill what he believed was his duty, as did we. But in the end, he yielded. He let me recover my sister's body. He surrendered the Tower of Joy rather than spill more blood." Robert gave Arthur a long, hard stare. "Barristan speaks highly of your honor. So does Ned, though grudgingly. I've heard you were the noblest of knights. But as far as I recall, you served a tyrant." Arthur's jaw tensed. He refused to speak in detail about Aerys or Rhaegar. That was not his place to unravel. "I served the crown. I have no love for what Aerys became." Robert grunted. "But you love Rhaegar still?" Arthur's eyes flickered. "Rhaegar was my friend. He was a good man, despite his mistakes." That caused a stir in the hall. Many still saw Rhaegar as a villain for abducting Lyanna, for triggering the war. Robert's rage showed in the way his lips thinned. "That's a lie," the king said, but he did not lunge from the throne. Instead, he inhaled, controlling himself. "So, you come here to beg my mercy?" Arthur's posture was proud. "I come to make my peace, if peace can be made." Silence. Then Robert let out a short laugh. "You have bollocks, Dayne. I'll grant you that. You killed a good number of my men. But then, you also killed a good number of my enemies in earlier battles. And you never put innocence to the sword. Everyone says that of you." Eddard, waiting for his moment, stepped forward. "Your Grace, I ask clemency for Ser Arthur Dayne. He is willing to swear no further claim or support for House Targaryen. He will not raise arms against you." Again the crowd murmured. Robert stared. "If you break that oath, Dayne," he said, voice rumbling in the hush, "I'll crush you myself, as easily as I crushed Rhaegar. Do you understand?" Arthur nodded. "Yes, Your Grace." Robert looked from Arthur to Ned, then shifted on the throne. "So what am I to do with you?" he mused, though loud enough for all to hear. "I have Barristan, but the rest of my Kingsguard is a sorry lot. Leftovers, half of them turncoats, half of them fresh boys. Perhaps I should force you to serve as my white cloak, to show the realm you've bent the knee." Arthur's eyes flickered at the suggestion. Could he truly wear the white cloak for Robert, the man who had spilled Rhaegar's blood, even if it meant continuing the vow of protecting the realm's king? To serve the realm was the vow behind every Kingsguard oath, but now the realm had a new king. "I will serve if that is the will of the crown," Arthur said at last, though his words weighed heavily. Robert sneered a bit, reading the reluctance. "Better than letting you skulk in the north. And having the famed sword of the morning at my side sends a fine message, does it not? That the realm is united now." He shifted again, as if uncomfortable. "But can I trust you, Dayne? Or will you slip a knife in my back the moment I turn?" Arthur took a single step forward, ignoring the tension of the guards at the edge of the hall. "I have never murdered a man except in open battle or by direct challenge. If I serve you, I will protect your life as I once protected the lives of Aerys and Rhaegar. That is the vow of a Kingsguard knight. And if some Targaryen pretender shows up," Robert growled, "will you fight for me then? Or go running back to the Dragon Banner?" Arthur paused, uncertain how to speak. Would he fight some lost Targaryen child, the last ember of Rhaegar's line? If that child lived, Arthur still felt a sense of duty. But the realm, the people, needed peace. The Targaryens had proven themselves a line of madness. Had they not? Rhaegar was exceptional, but he was gone. Aerys had been monstrous. Perhaps no good could come of stoking that old flame. He closed his eyes, remembering Rhaegar's harp. "If I swear to serve you," he said quietly, "it will be with all my honor. I will not break my oath." A hush. Robert regarded him with a glower. Then suddenly, the king burst into roaring laughter that echoed in the hall. "By the gods, you're as stiff as Ned sometimes. All right, Dayne. Bend the knee and swear it here in front of the realm that you will serve Robert Baratheon, first of his name, as a true Kingsguard. And we will have done with this tension." Arthur's heart thundered. Kneeling to Robert Baratheon was an act more symbolic and humiliating than anything he had done before. But if it could ensure the realm's peace, and keep House Dayne and House Stark from retribution, could he refuse? Slowly, Arthur descended to one knee. The onlookers pressed forward, straining for a better view. He placed Dawn's tip on the stone floor and bowed his head. The sword glimmered in the torchlight, the pale blade reflecting a faint star-like glow. "I, Arthur Dayne, do swear fealty to Robert Baratheon, my king. I shall guard his life, his honor, and his heirs, and serve him with all the skill of my sword arm, forsaking all others. I pledge my life and my shield in defense of his crown." The words echoed. In Arthur's mind, they felt both foreign and painfully familiar. He had sworn something so similar once before, to the old throne, to House Targaryen. His choice now was a betrayal of old vows, but it was also an embrace of the living realm. Robert let out a breath. "Rise, Sir Arthur Dayne, Kingsguard to the realm." A few courtiers clapped, but many stood in shocked silence. Arthur rose, face impassive. For better or worse, he was now bound to the man who had destroyed Rhaegar. Robert studied him a moment longer, then rose from the throne. "Barristan, come forward." From the side, Barristan Selmy strode forward, clad in the white cloak of the Kingsguard. His face was etched with lines of age and care, but he still moved with the poise of a legendary knight. He clasped Arthur's arm, searching his eyes with a hint of relief. Robert said, "Sir Barristan, you have your new brother. Show him to his quarters in the White Sword Tower. May he serve as faithfully as you." Barristan bowed. The new Kingsguard parted the crowd, leading Arthur away from the Iron Throne. Over his shoulder, Arthur glimpsed Eddard Stark's expression, relief tempered by sorrow. They had found a compromise, but no man could say what the future would hold. And so Arthur took up residence in the White Sword Tower, once the seat of the Targaryen Kingsguard, now the seat of Robert's. He was given crisp white robes, a fresh cloak, and the storied white armor that had once symbolized the highest chivalry in the Seven Kingdoms. Arthur felt as if he were walking through a strange dream. The same halls, the same vow, but a different king. Barristan welcomed him kindly. "I never thought I'd see you again," the older knight confided when they were alone in the tower's common room. "Some said you perished at the Tower of Joy. Others said you fled across the narrow sea. I'm glad you survived." Arthur could only nod. "And I never imagined you'd swear to Robert." Barristan pressed his lips together. After the sack, there was little choice. I was badly wounded, and Robert spared me. He gave me his hand and said the realm needed good men. I accepted. Perhaps this is the best way to prevent further cruelty. It has not been easy, Arthur. Arthur understood. The Targaryen loyalists were scattered or killed. Many had turned their cloaks. The few honorable knights who survived, like Barristan, had to choose between death or service to Robert. Some had gone into exile. Others had vanished. He stood at the window, gazing at the city's rooftops. I just pray this king is not like the last one. Barristan nodded gravely. Robert can be rash, but he's no tyrant like Aerys. He's honorable in his own way. He loves a good fight, a good feast, and can be merciful when he wills it. But he's surrounded by ambitious men. Tywin Lannister, for instance, and all his brood. We must remain vigilant. The realm always needs protectors. Arthur accepted the truth of that. It was an echo of what had drawn him to the Kingsguard in the first place. We do our duty, he said, half to himself, for the sake of the realm. For several months, Arthur served in King's Landing with outward loyalty. Robert tested him repeatedly. Staging hunts, organizing small tournaments, inviting Arthur to spar with the best knights of the realm. Arthur found that few could match him with a blade, aside from Barristan, who remained a close equal. The court soon buzzed with talk of the two living legends among the Kingsguard. Robert took pride in it, boasting to visitors about the strength of his guard. But beneath the revelry, there was a tension. Arthur sensed that Robert still resented him for Rhaegar's memory, that the king's mocking jests about the dragons revealed an underlying insecurity. At feasts, Robert would drink heavily and goad Arthur with talk of the good old days of the rebellion. How he and Ned had smashed the Targaryens. How he had caved in Rhaegar's breastplate with a single blow. More than once, Arthur had to clench his fist under the table to keep from retorting. The memory of Rhaegar's death weighed heavily on him, yet he was sworn not to challenge the king. He found some solace with Barristan, or in quiet corners of the Red Keep. He spent time in the White Sword Towers reading Nook, flipping through the pages of the old white book that recorded the deeds of every Kingsguard. His own page ended abruptly, sent to the Tower of Joy by Prince Rhaegar to guard his new paramour. Fell in battle. The text had not been updated with the new reality. Arthur decided to let it remain incomplete for now. One day, after a rigorous training session, Barristan approached him with a grave expression. Arthur, we must talk. There is word that Viserys Targaryen yet lives in Essos. Perhaps also the infant Princess Daenerys, though that is uncertain. Robert's spymaster keeps watch. He is more concerned about any possible boy who might rally Targaryen loyalists. Arthur's heart quickened. So a fragment of House Targaryen endured. He tried to keep his voice level. They are children. Would Robert see them murdered? Barristan exhaled. Varys is the spymaster. He suggests the children pose no immediate threat, but the King's Council. Some want to send assassins to end the line entirely. Arthur swallowed hard, rage coursing through him. To kill helpless children was an abomination. Yet he had sworn to protect the king. Did that vow extend to participating in such vile acts? I cannot stand by if they do that, he said, voice low. Barristan's gaze was sad. Nor can I, but we are a minority here. The Lannisters are cunning, and the council has men who believe the Targaryens must be wiped out to avoid future uprisings. That evening, Arthur paced his chamber. He felt the old conflict, loyalty to the crown or loyalty to the Targaryen children. He had sworn not to rise against Robert so long as Robert showed him good faith. But this was too far. If Robert openly ordered the murder of children, how could Arthur uphold his vow? He found an unexpected ally in Eddard Stark, who had come to King's Landing again to serve briefly on the small council. Ned confided in Arthur that he, too, found the notion of slaying Targaryen children abhorrent. He had once parted ways with Robert over the murder of Princess Rhaenys and Prince Aegon. Ned insisted that it was dishonorable and cruel to harm children for the sins of their fathers. However, Robert had not yet issued any official edict. So Arthur and Ned waited, watching the political machinations swirl. Months turned into a year. Robert busied himself with tournaments and feasts, spending coin lavishly. He seemed determined to enjoy his reign, ignoring warnings about rising debts and unrest in distant corners of the realm. The Lannisters grew in influence, as Tywin's gold propped up the crown. Barristan grew uneasy, but continued to serve. Arthur remained stoic, a silent guardian at official ceremonies. No direct threat to the Targaryen exiles emerged, which gave them some measure of relief. Arthur reasoned that as long as Viserys stayed across the narrow sea with his sister, they posed little risk. The realm might remain stable if Robert was not provoked. But stability would soon fray. Whispers of rebellion in the Iron Islands surfaced. Balon Greyjoy was testing the new monarchy's strength. Tension with Dorne still simmered, for Prince Doran Martell had not forgiven the murder of Elia and her children, though he played the game quietly. Meanwhile, the Tyrells in Highgarden were polite but distant. The realm was far from united in spirit, even if Robert sat on the throne. Arthur watched with a growing sense of foreboding. He began to see how easy it would be for the realm to slide back into war. Robert's hold was built on shaky alliances, blood debts, and the fear of the Lannister gold. If one great house rose in revolt, the entire realm might burn again. And in the midst of it all, Arthur felt the restlessness that came from wearing white cloaks for a king he did not truly respect. Then came the day that changed the course of everything. A letter arrived from Dorne, from Arthur's own house Dayne. He was in the yard, putting a young squire through sword drills, when a messenger approached and bowed with a parchment. Arthur took it with careful hands, noticing the seal of Starfall. He excused himself to read it in private. With each line, a cold dread seeped into him. The letter was from Ashera Dayne, written in a shaky hand that suggested heartbreak. Arthur, I write in desperation. Our Lord Father is dead. He succumbed to fever this winter. Edric is but a child, and I do what I can to guide our house. But troubles brew in the mountains. A group of outlaw knights, calling themselves the True Blades of the Dawn, have gathered men loyal to Prince Rhaegar's memory. They claim to fight for the return of a rightful Targaryen heir. They speak your name as well, Arthur, saying you will rise to lead them. We beg you to disavow them. They spread rumors that the Sword of the Morning remains loyal to the dragon. They have raided caravans carrying provisions for House Baratheon's garrisons. Dornish lords sympathetic to Prince Oberyn's anger feed them coin. This can only lead to tragedy. King Robert's forces will retaliate and Dorne will suffer. For the love we bear each other, please, come back to Dorne if you can. Make them stand down or they will plunge us into war. You are the only one who can speak reason to them. In grief and hope, Ashera. Arthur stared at the page, heart pounding. The words True Blades of the Dawn leapt out at him. He remembered the hush in Robert's court whenever Targaryen loyalists were mentioned. This was precisely the sort of spark that could ignite the kingdom. If King Robert learned that a band of rebels invoked Arthur's name, he might brand Arthur a traitor and lash out at Dorne. That could lead to a new conflict, possibly drawing in the Martells and others who still despised the Lannisters. Arthur's mind reeled. He was caught in an impossible position again. But he still had family in Starfall and a responsibility to them. If he did nothing, the outlaws would continue their raids in his name, perhaps inciting a full-scale crackdown on Dorne. That evening, Arthur sought an audience with Robert. Barristan warned him that the king was in a sour mood after receiving pleas for funds from the Crownlands. Yet Arthur pressed on. He entered the king's solar to find Robert draining a cup of ale, half reclined on a couch while some minstrels tried to entertain him. The moment Robert saw Arthur's expression, he dismissed the minstrels with a wave. "What is it now, Dayne?" the king muttered. Arthur presented the letter. "There is a group of outlaws in Dorne, styling themselves Targaryen loyalists. They claim to act in my name." Robert's eyes lit with anger, and he sat up abruptly. "In your name? Are you behind this?" "No, your grace," Arthur said firmly, controlling his own flare of frustration. "But they are there, sowing chaos, claiming that I will return to lead them. It is a lie. and if we do not put a stop to it, it may provoke open conflict. My sister begs me to come and negotiate their surrender." Robert swore under his breath. "I'll have their heads. Dornish rebels. Ha! I knew those snakes wouldn't keep the peace forever. And they dare use your name to stir trouble? This is exactly what I feared when I let you live." Arthur forced himself to remain calm. "I have a chance to end this without bloodshed. If you allow me to travel to Dorne, I can speak with them. I believe they will listen to me." Robert barked a humorless laugh. "Trust you to roam around Dorne, stirring up who knows what behind my back? Are you mad? You'll come back at the head of a bloody army. Or maybe you won't come back at all, and I'll have to send my forces south." Arthur lifted his chin. "I gave you my oath, Your Grace. I stand by it. But these men are using my name to revolt. Allow me to end this peacefully, or you will be forced to crush them, and many innocents will die." The king glared at him, jaw clenched. "You have your vow, but how can I know you won't betray me?" Barristan, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. "Your Grace, if I may speak?" Robert gave a curt nod. Barristan said, "Ser Arthur has served loyally these past many moons. He has protected you in hunts, stood by you in tournaments, never once faltered. And if there is anyone the Dornish rebels might heed, it is him. If he does not go, the crown will be forced into a full campaign, which will be costly in lives and gold." Robert stared at Barristan a long moment. Then he downed another gulp of ale. "Very well, but I won't send you alone, Dayne. You'll have men of mine accompanying you to keep watch. And if there is the slightest hint of treachery, I'll personally ride south and put Starfall to the torch." Arthur's throat tightened. "Understood, Your Grace." Robert sat back, scowling. "You can leave in a fortnight. Make your preparations. And remember, if you betray me, I'll kill you, your sister, and every damn Dayne in Starfall. Do I make myself clear?" Arthur bowed stiffly. "Yes, Your Grace." Within 2 weeks, Arthur set out for Dorne with a small contingent of royal guards, plus Barristan and a few knights who knew the region. It was a tense departure. Arthur could sense the suspicion in the men's gazes. Only Barristan offered any real camaraderie, and even he was on edge, mindful of the precarious mission. They traveled by ship down the coast to Sunspear, then continued overland toward Starfall. The Dornish sun burned overhead, a stark contrast to the gloom of King's Landing. Arthur found himself enveloped in old memories of the place he once called home. The dryness of the air, the pinkish hue of the stone in distant mountains, the slender silhouettes of date palms. Everywhere he went, he saw signs of war's aftermath. Banners of House Martell still hung limp over quiet strongholds. Villages that had once thrived on trade from the rest of Westeros seemed subdued. The presence of the crown's soldiers only further unsettled the local folk. They reached Starfall at dusk on the 5th day, the sun painting the sky in fiery orange. The castle perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Torrentine River. White stone walls caught the last gleams of daylight, and Arthur felt a pang of longing for home. They were greeted by Ashera Dayne herself, dressed in a muted lavender gown. She hurried to Arthur's side and embraced him tightly, ignoring the armed men. "Brother," she murmured, tears shining in her eyes. He held her in a firm embrace, mindful of the stares from the crown's men. Barristan offered a courteous bow to Ashera, recalling her from past visits to King's Landing. In private, Ashera explained all she knew. The rebel band, calling themselves the True Blades, had sworn to raise a Targaryen pretender, likely Viserys. They believed Arthur Dayne would return to them once the time was ripe, that his presence in King's Landing was just a clever ruse. They had attacked crown caravans, believing that each blow would weaken Robert's grip on the realm. "It is madness," Ashera said, pacing the solar. "They have no real support from the major Dornish houses, and yet they continue. Their leader is a knight named Ser Joffrey Will, known to be hot-tempered. He claims some old alliance with House Dayne." Arthur pressed his lips together. "I'll demand their surrender. If they stand down, Robert may show mercy." Barristan, standing near the window, gazed over the courtyard. "He will if they come willingly, but if they fight, Robert won't hesitate to retaliate harshly." Arthur nodded. "Then I must reach them quickly. No more raids." Ashera gave him the location of their encampment, hidden in the foothills near the Prince's Pass. Arthur made plans to ride out at dawn, accompanied by a small escort. The rest of the crown's men would wait nearby, ready to move if negotiations failed. Arthur prayed it would not come to a bloody confrontation. That night, he walked the ramparts of Starfall, reacquainting himself with the shape of its walls, the sound of the Torrentine rushing below. This was the place where he had grown up, dreaming of knighthood, dreaming of the day he might be judged worthy to bear the ancestral blade, Dawn. He had risen to be the sword of the morning, to serve in the Kingsguard, and everything had turned to chaos. Now, ironically, he was pledged to the very king who had destroyed his friend. He asked himself if he had betrayed the memory of Rhaegar, or perhaps Rhaegar's memory was best served by preserving peace in the realm. In the distant sky, the stars shone brightly, but he did not feel their comfort. Dawn came, pale and sharp, the sky lit by a faint orange glow. Arthur mounted his horse with Barristan at his side. A handful of the crown's men joined them, as did a few Dayne retainers who knew the desert paths. They rode west, ascending through rocky canyons and scrublands until the heat of midday beat down on them. Following Ashara's directions, they circled around a craggy pass and approached a hidden valley. Smoke rose in thin tendrils from a cluster of canvas tents, confirming the presence of an encampment. Arthur dismounted, ordering the party to approach with caution. He could see armed men, some with battered shields bearing old Targaryen sigils. A sentry spotted them. Moments later, a half-dozen riders galloped out, brandishing spears. "Hold!" Arthur shouted, raising one hand. He allowed his white cloak, dusty from travel, to flutter behind him, a symbol that might give them pause. Sure enough, the riders drew up short, confused by the presence of what appeared to be a Kingsguard. They recognized Arthur's face, or at least recognized Dawn at his hip. "Ser Arthur?" one of them exclaimed. "You've come to lead us?" Arthur shook his head sternly. "I've come to talk sense into you. Is Ser Joffrey will hear?" Relieved shouts echoed as more rebels appeared from the camp. These men were a motley crew. Some wore sun-scorched mail, others had tattered tabards of House Targaryen from the war. A tall, lean knight with a hawk-like nose emerged, wearing a half-dented helm under his arm. His surcoat bore the sigil of House Will, a black adder biting a heel. "Ser Arthur," the man called. "At last. I knew you would come once you heard we had not abandoned the rightful king's cause." Arthur advanced, Barristan at his flank. The crown's men hung back, tense. "Ser Joffrey," Arthur said, voice clear, "lay down your arms. This rebellion gains nothing but suffering. The Targaryens are defeated. King Robert sits the throne. If you continue these attacks, you will bring fire and blood down upon Dorne. Joffrey will frown in disbelief. You speak as if you serve the usurper." His gaze darted to the white cloak. "Have you truly forsaken your vows to the dragon?" Arthur's temper flared. "I swore to protect the king, the realm. Those days are gone. Rhaegar is dead. Aerys is dead. Viserys and his sister are children in exile. Think you they can cross the sea with an army at their backs and take the throne? Even if they did, more blood would flow. More innocents would die." A mutter spread through the gathered men. Some looked uncertain, while others glared at Arthur with accusation. "How can you say that, Ser Arthur?" barked one rebel. "We all believed in Prince Rhaegar's dream. You're the greatest knight in the realm. With you at our head, we could rally Dorne, the Reach." "Enough," Arthur said coldly. "Rally them to what? Another war? Another devastation of the countryside? The realm is weary. Thousands died in the last conflict. And if House Martell wanted war, they would have declared it by now. They do not. This is not some glorious quest." Ser Joffrey took a step back, anger in his eyes. "We serve Prince Viserys. We will not bend to Robert the usurper. If you have chosen to kneel to him, you are no better than Barristan the Bold or the other turncloaks. Arthur's hand clenched at the hilt of Dawn. We did what was needed to spare the realm. I have family in Dorne. My father just died, and my nephew is a child. Do you think House Dayne wants you raiding crown caravans in our name, bringing Robert's wrath down upon us? A hush settled, and some of the rebels shifted uncomfortably. They glanced at each other, at the worn, hungry faces of their fellows. Barristan stepped forward, speaking in a calm, steady tone. No one questions your bravery, but the king's wrath is real, and if you do not disband, he will send a host to crush you. We stand here offering a chance to end this without bloodshed. No man here wants more innocent lives lost. Ser Joffrey's expression twisted, torn between reverence for the legendary knights standing before him and hatred for the new king they served. He spat on the ground. We are not cowards. If we must die, we'll die as loyal men. But we'd rather have Ser Arthur lead us to victory. Arthur shook his head. That cannot be. I will not fight King Robert. If you persist in this, you doom yourselves. From behind Joffrey, one of the younger men shouted, "Traitor!" Another brandished a spear. Tension crackled like lightning in the hot Dornish air. Arthur raised his voice, though he kept it level. My loyalty is to the good of the realm. Prince Rhaegar wanted a better world, not endless war. Lay down your arms, return to your homes. I will do what I can to petition the crown for mercy. Some in the crowd visibly wavered. They had followed illusions. Their hopes were pinned on a dream that the Sword of the Morning would rally them for a dead prince's cause. That dream was dying before them. Ser Joffrey's face hardened. If you will not lead us, then we have no more need of you. He motioned, and a cluster of rebels drew their weapons. The tension snapped. Hold! Arthur barked, but the men rushed forward. The crown's guards, seeing the aggression, began to move, swords drawn. Barristan stepped in front of Arthur, preparing to deflect an incoming blow. In a flash, Dawn swept free of its scabbard. Arthur pivoted and disarmed the first man with a single, brutal slash that sent the rebel's sword spinning. Another lunged at Barristan, who parried easily. The crown's men rushed to form a perimeter, outnumbered but better trained. The rebels advanced in chaotic clumps, shouts filling the air. "Stop!" Arthur roared, but to no avail. Spears jabbed, swords clanged. Blood splattered on the dusty ground. Arthur moved as a blur, disarming, disabling, but refusing to strike fatal blows if he could help it. Yet the rebels fought with desperate fury. Barristan engaged three at once, fluid and controlled, his blade a deadly arc. The crown's knights also fought valiantly, but were forced into lethal force by the rebels' ferocity. Several men fell on both sides. Arthur glimpsed a rebel collapse from a gut wound, screaming as he clutched his entrails. Ser Joffrey lunged for Arthur, eyes burning. Their blades met in a shower of sparks, steel sliding on steel. Joffrey spat curses at Arthur. "You were supposed to be our Dawn, not this white-cloaked wraith." Arthur grimaced, deflecting blow after blow. The man was a skilled knight, but Arthur was a legend. He battered through Joffrey's guard, slamming him in the ribs with the pommel of Dawn, then hooking his ankle to sweep him to the ground. The rebel's sword clattered away. Arthur pressed Dawn's tip to Joffrey's throat, panting. "Yield," he demanded. Joffrey snarled, spitting blood. "Never." Before Arthur could react, Joffrey jerked forward, impaling his own throat on Dawn's tip. It happened in a heartbeat, the knight's eyes rolling back. Arthur yanked the blade away, aghast. Blood poured from Joffrey's neck, and he collapsed in a boneless heap. Arthur stared, heart hammering. The rebel leader was dead, having chosen to die rather than yield to the king's men. Around him, the violence was subsiding. Many rebels, seeing their leader fall, broke and fled into the rocky terrain. A few dropped their weapons, arms raised. The crown's guards were left breathing heavily, bloodied, scanning for further threats. Barristan stepped over a corpse. "Are you hurt?" Arthur shook his head, trembling. No, he knelt beside Joffrey's body, feeling grief and frustration. Another pointless death. The man had wanted so badly to believe in a lost cause. As the dust settled, Arthur surveyed the ruined camp. Tents were torn, bodies scattered, wounded men groaning. A handful of rebels had been captured alive. Others had escaped into the hills. Barristan quietly began organizing the crown's men to secure the area. Arthur cleaned Dawn's blade, numb to the swirl of voices around him. He had come to prevent bloodshed, but blood was spilled. In the aftermath, Arthur and Barristan oversaw the taking of prisoners. Arthur insisted that these men be treated fairly, hoping to secure mercy from King Robert. They found evidence of further caches of arms and small amounts of gold from unknown benefactors. Many suspected that certain lords of Dorne had quietly supported the rebel cause, but there was no proof linking them directly. Arthur's name was tarnished among the rebels who fled. They would call him an oathbreaker to the dragon cause, a traitor. Perhaps that was fair. Yet to Arthur, it was better to be called a traitor than to stoke more war. They returned to Starfall with the prisoners in tow. Ashera greeted them anxiously, and Arthur gave her the bitter news of Joffrey Will's death and the end of the so-called True Blades. She pressed her lips tight, tears welling. If only they had listened. Barristan left with half the crown's men to deliver messages to Sunspear, ensuring that Prince Doran Martell would not be implicated in the rebellion. Arthur remained briefly at Starfall to see to the wounded. He visited the local sept, lighting a candle for the dead rebels and for Joffrey Will. He also paid respects to his father's tomb, kneeling in silent prayer. As he stood in the crypt, the cool air thick with the scent of dust and ancient stone, Arthur reflected on the path he'd taken. He was a Kingsguard knight sworn to a king he did not love. He had just killed fellow Dornishmen who believed in the Targaryens. He felt no triumph, only a hollow sense of duty. When they finally departed Starfall, Ashara's farewell was more subdued than ever. She understood the weight on Arthur's soul, though she did not speak it aloud. "Take care of yourself, brother," she said, clasping his hands. "And if you can, come back to us." Arthur promised he would. Then he rode out with the prisoners, bound for King's Landing. The journey back was somber and tense. They encountered no further attacks. The rebellious spirit seemed to have been crushed. Upon arriving in the capital, Arthur reported directly to Robert. He stood in the throne room, repeating the tale of the skirmish, the leader's death, and the handful of prisoners. Robert listened, hands folded over his broad chest, eyes thoughtful. In the end, the king commended Arthur for putting down the revolt. "You see, your presence was worth something," Robert said. "You've proven yourself loyal." He spoke the word with a mix of grudging respect and lingering doubt. Arthur bowed, though the gesture was stiff. He could feel the stares of courtiers of the other Kingsguard. He had been forced to slay men who honored the Targaryen name. A part of him had died with them, perhaps, but he did not show it. "I serve the realm," Arthur said simply, echoing the vow that had once bound him to a golden dragon prince. Robert nodded. "The realm, yes." He eyed Arthur with a calculating expression. "I see how you look when I speak of Rhaegar, but you have proven your fealty. I'll trust you, for now. Continue to serve me well, and you'll be rewarded." Barristan, standing nearby, glanced at Arthur with quiet sympathy. They both knew that the path Arthur had chosen was not one that offered much peace of mind. Some months passed. The tension between Robert and Dorne eased slightly after the swift end to the rebellion. However, mutters continued about whether other Targaryen loyalists might rise up. Robert's council watched Arthur closely, as if expecting him to revert to old loyalties at any sign of a Targaryen claimant. Meanwhile, Arthur carried out his duties in King's Landing, patrolling the corridors, standing guard over the king, accompanying him on hunts. Gradually, the shock of the Dornish revolt receded into memory. The realm, it seemed, had avoided a larger conflagration. Yet peace remained fragile. The Iron Islands threatened rebellion under Balon Greyjoy. The Lannisters grew bolder in their use of crown funds, and rumors from Essos hinted that Viserys Targaryen was forging new alliances. The day might come when Robert demanded that Arthur embark on a mission to slay the last Targaryens. That day weighed heavily on Arthur's thoughts. And so, in the deep hours of the night, Arthur would sometimes wake in a cold sweat. The bed in the White Sword Tower felt foreign. Dawn rested against the wall, silent and glowing faintly in the moonlight. He would think of the Tower of Joy, of Rhaegar's harp, of Lyanna's frail body. He would wonder if in following Robert, he had truly ensured the best future for the realm, or if he had merely lent his skill to a new brand of folly. His dreams turned to chaos. The trident running red with blood, visions of a dragon hatching from stone, storm clouds swirling around a massive tower, and a crown of swords. He'd awaken. The images burned into his mind. He did not understand them, but he feared they might presage another war, one that not even the sword of the morning could avert. Still, Arthur Dayne continued his vigil. The realm needed protectors, needed men of honor to stand between chaos and peace. If Robert Baratheon truly embraced the role of a just king, Arthur would uphold his vow. Yet if Robert proved to be another tyrant, Arthur wondered if, one day, he would have to break his oath again and challenge the man who sat upon the Iron Throne. Such a day had not yet come, but the realms will turned, and storms brewed in the distance. As Arthur gazed from the top of the White Sword Tower, he thought of the swirling rumor that Viserys was seeking marriage alliances in the free cities. He thought of the restlessness in the Iron Islands, the quiet rancor in Dorne, and the cunning glances of Tywin Lannister. Arthur breathed in, letting the night air fill his lungs. For now, he was bound to Robert Baratheon by a Kingsguard's vow. But destiny had not finished weaving its tapestry. Perhaps, in time, the realm would call him again, this time not as a sworn knight to a single king, but as a champion of something greater. Whatever fate held, Arthur Dayne would be ready. Dawn was in his hands, and dawn would come again to Westeros, one way or another. And if Robert Baratheon ever turned tyrant, or if a true Targaryen heir emerged with rightful claim, the Sword of the Morning might be forced to decide where his loyalties lay. Until that day, Arthur remained watchful, a brilliant blade in white cloak, haunted by the ghosts of the past, yet steadfast in the vow he had made to serve and protect. By the light of the dawn or the darkness of the night, he would stand, a silent sentinel of the realm's fragile peace, knowing all too well how easily it could shatter.